Hello friends, welcome to Autumn at St. Andrew. It is my privilege to welcome you here today from the beautiful St. Andrew Sanctuary. I am grateful as always to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. St. Andrew is proud to be an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome here and you belong here. If you have any questions about our church, prayer requests for our care team, or if you would like to get in touch with a member of our pastoral team or staff, please email info@gostandrew.com. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the St. Andrew community through our many classes, group life gatherings, and service opportunities, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We would love to hear from you. Just as a reminder, our full Sunday morning worship services, complete with music, prayer, announcements, liturgy, ministry spotlights, and the sermon, are live streamed on our YouTube page each week and permanently archived for viewing anytime. Lastly, to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can always visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. And now let's listen together to this week's scripture and sermon.
A reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 26 to 30. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Decades ago, one of the most famous business moguls in America was a man named Lee Iacocca. Perhaps you've heard of him. He led Ford Motor Company for over 30 years and was best known for developing the iconic Ford Mustang back in the 1960s. Back in the day, Lee Iacocca was kind of a big deal. And one night, as the story goes, a stranger bumped into Iacocca at a restaurant in Dearborn, Michigan. He recognized Iacocca immediately, walked over to his table and said, "Mr. Iacocca, my name is Jack. It's an incredible honor to meet you. I've read your book. I've heard you speak. I'm a big fan." And as they were shaking hands, an idea suddenly crossed Jack's mind. He said, "Mr. Iacocca, in a few minutes I'll be having an important business dinner over at that corner table. And it would really impress my guests if at some point during my meeting, you could walk over to my table and say, 'Hello, Jack.' You know, like you really know me. Just a simple, 'Hello, Jack.'" Iacocca, it turns out, was happy to play along. And so several minutes later, he walked over to that corner table and on cue said, "Hello, Jack. How are you doing?" As everyone around that table stared at Jack in astonishment, Jack glanced up at Iacocca and said, "Not now, Lee. I'm busy." Have you ever tried to appear a little more important or impressive or influential or put together than you really are? Well, welcome to the human race, my friends, and to the race so many of us tend to be running these days. In the modern world, we all struggle with this cultural pressure to sell ourselves as someone who has it all together, to outwardly display this aura of competence, confidence, success, worthiness. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, by the way. The chances of us getting very far in life by exuding incompetence or a lack of drive or self-confidence are not super favorable. So let's be honest, there are certain advantages to showing up to the world with our best selves. But the problem arises when we start to believe that our best self is the only self that's allowed to show up to the world, and that in order to be accepted or worthy or even successful, we must hide or disguise or compensate for that part of ourselves we fear is somehow broken or flawed or unattractive. When that happens, we become plagued by what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, this crippling state of dis-ease that arises from the contradiction we feel between the image we have of ourselves and the image we're trying to project to the world. We see this gap between the person we really are and the person we're trying to be for others, and we assume we must compensate for that gap. And so we pretend to have it all together when we're actually falling apart, or we pretend to be strong when we're actually scared to death, or we project success and confidence when it actually feels like we are failing miserably. It is an awful experience, and we have all lived through it. Maybe some of us are living through it right now. Simply put, it's the fear of not measuring up. And it's the worst and most universal of all human fears. Some fears are unique to certain people. Not everyone, for example, suffers from claustrophobia, the fear of confined spaces, or arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, or acrophobia, the fear of heights. Not everyone, thankfully, suffers from homilophobia, which is the fear of sermons. And if you do, I have absolutely no sympathy for you. But everyone suffers to some degree from what's called kakophobia. That's the fear of failure, the fear of making a mistake. And it's the most debilitating of all fears. It affects all of us, but it's most acutely felt by today's teenagers. Students often report that the number one struggle in their lives is stress over achievement, grades, test scores, athletics, college admissions. They can feel like every decision, every test, every performance, every competition is so consequential that it will affect the entire course of their lives forever. And when they inevitably do come up short or make a mistake, as we all do, it for them can feel like the end of the world. And because they lack the life experiences to keep failure in perspective, they can feel overwhelmed. Even adults experience this, which is why what we do as a church and what we experience in Christian community can be so very life-saving and liberating. Here in church, we discover that there is an alternative to the cult of perfection that pervades our modern world. It's called the body of Christ. And it is symbolized in something as ordinary and unadorned as a simple loaf of bread that's been broken in two. On his last night on earth, Jesus gathered his best friends together in a little house. They were all a little on edge, riddled with fear and uncertainty about what was going to happen next to Jesus. He had been dropping little hints that he wasn't going to be around much longer and that things were not going to end well for him. He kept talking about death and suffering, but no one wanted to think about that. Everyone present that night knew that Jesus was a wanted and now hunted man. And they all sensed that he was deeply troubled and distracted and torn. What they didn't know was that Jesus needed to prepare them for what was about to happen next to him. His arrest and crucifixion, he knew, would scatter and spiral them in fear and self-doubt and denial. Seeing him die on a cross would wreck them, break them, and they'd be overwhelmed by grief and regret and the feeling that they had failed him, as if they could have or should have done more. Knowing what was to come for them, Jesus gathers them together and hosts a meal for them. It would be his last meal with them. But I imagine it was more like a party than a solemn Last Supper. I hope more laughter and wine than tears and sadness. We don't know all that transpired that night, but we do know that after everyone had eaten, Jesus took a loaf of bread and he held it up for everyone to see. And then he said the most memorable words, maybe the most important words he'd ever spoken to anyone ever. "This is my body," he said. And then he broke the loaf of bread in half. It wasn't just the words he spoke or just his act of breaking the bread that made it all so powerful and unforgettable. It was how he joined the two of those together. Now, without the words, "This is my body," the act of breaking the bread would probably just seem like an extension of the meal they were already having. And without the act of breaking the bread, the words, "This is my body," would probably just confirm what Jesus had already taught them many days before, on a different occasion when he told them, "I am the bread of life." But to say, "This is my body," while breaking the bread in two, this changed everything. Because what he was really saying was, just like this bread, I am broken. He held it up, this broken bread, this now broken life, so all could see it. "Look," he said, this is me. I'm broken now. And it's not so bad. It's actually beautiful. Jesus here has stripped away everything else about him. The status, acclaim, success, all the praise that the world had bestowed on him, the divine power manifest in his miracles and healings and teachings. He's stripped that all away so that in this moment, it's just Jesus and his human brokenness for everyone to see. He doesn't hide it, disguise it, or try to put it all back together again to make it whole, to pretend he has it all together. He just says, "This is me. I'm broken now." And isn't it beautiful? In that symbolic act, Jesus breaks himself so that we can see the beauty of our own brokenness. And finally know that brokenness is not meant to be hidden or concealed or disguised or even feared. In that moment, the breaking of the bread becomes the breaking of the curse we all live under. The curse of failure, the curse of brokenness, the curse that demands perfection. It's almost like he's saying, are you afraid of your brokenness? Are you afraid to name it, to see it, or let others see it? Are you afraid of being broken by making a mistake or failing or not measuring up or coming apart at the seams or blowing it big time? Let me break myself here now, he says, to show you that brokenness is nothing to be afraid of and nothing to be ashamed of. We are all broken people who live and mend by grace. But our problem is that we often associate broken people with damaged goods. And in our throwaway culture, damaged goods are disposable and irredeemable. And so we tend to worry a lot that others might see our brokenness and dispose of us and dump us. Have you ever actually been to the local dump? I know we're supposed to call it a landfill these days because that sounds more civilized and sanitized, but let's be honest. whatever we choose to call this, we don't go there to fill the land. We go there to dump damaged goods, unwanted stuff, broken things that are now worthless to us, which makes the landfill one of the most depressing places on earth. The wreckage and relics of modern consumerism are on full display there. It's a sad place, and it literally stinks. The last time I visited a landfill was a few years ago to dispose of a pine tree that had died in my front yard. And while I arrived there, these two guys next to my truck were unloading theirs, unloading of all things this massive 8-person hot tub. Are you following this? A full-size jacuzzi actually went into the earth forever. I did check to make sure it was empty, that no one was in it at the time. Because isn't that what we often do with broken people too? We deem them damaged goods and too broken to be redeemed, so we haul them away. We leave them behind. This is why in the breaking of the bread, Jesus breaks himself to show us that even broken people are beautiful. And if you read the Bible, you'll find that it's full of broken people, by the way. Noah was a drunk. Jacob was a thief. Moses was a murderer who also had a speech impediment. David was an adulterer and a murderer. Rahab was a prostitute. Peter was a denier. Martha was a worrier. Zacchaeus was a tax collector who worked for the Romans. And even Paul, the apostle, confesses to having this unnamed thorn in his flesh. And yet, what did Paul say about that brokenness in his life? He said, I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I am, he says, content with weaknesses. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Broken people everywhere, even here in church, especially here in church. That should be the whole point of being a church. The body of Christ is this gathering of imperfect, broken people who've chosen to live by mending, who believe that God's grace is the glue, and then who feel called to help mend other broken people. We're all broken in some way. Sometimes we break ourselves through our own choices, actions, mistakes, regrets. Sometimes life breaks us through tragedy, loss, suffering, violence. Sometimes others break us through words of hate, abuse, oppression. But Jesus knows that you can't mend what you cannot or pretend not to see. And so he breaks himself and holds up his brokenness for all of us to see. And in so doing, he invites us to pull our brokenness out of the darkness of shame and to befriend it. And like Jesus, to place it under the light of God's blessing. And when we do that, we discover that our brokenness does not have to be an obstacle to the joy and peace we long for, but in fact can instead become a means to it. The late Jesuit writer Henry Nouwen said, the great secret of the spiritual life is that everything we live, be it gladness or sadness, joy or pain, health or illness, can all be part of the journey toward the full realization of our humanity. In other words, even our brokenness can be used for God's purposes. I see it often. People who break the curse of perfection and put their brokenness under God's blessing and discover over time that they've become strong enough in the broken places to help mend others. It's beautiful when it happens. a recovering alcoholic who becomes a sponsor for others, a mother who's lost a child to suicide, who volunteers to answer phones for a hotline, an adult survivor of child abuse who becomes a therapist or a victim's advocate, a wounded warrior who finds healing by counseling fellow soldiers coming home from war. Broken people mending broken people by their own stories and by God's grace. It's what Jesus did when he broke the bread and said, "This is my body broken for you." In 1971, Leonard Bernstein wrote a musical entitled Mass. It was written in memory of John F. Kennedy for the occasion of the grand opening of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. The reviews were rather mixed. But in the concluding scene, there's a priest that's dressed in this gorgeous liturgical vestment and holding a beautiful glass chalice. And he's lifted high above the stage by a pyramid of dancers when suddenly the dancers stumble and the priest falls and crashes to the floor. And in the fall, his vestments are stripped away and the glass chalice is shattered. Slowly, the priest rises to his feet. He's now wearing just blue jeans and a t-shirt. As he walks barefoot through the broken debris of his former glory, a children's choir begins singing the words of the ancient Laudate. Praise, praise, praise be to God. For the longest time, the priest looks down at all the pieces of the broken chalice until at last he speaks the final words of the musical. He says, "Look, isn't that odd? I never realized that broken glass could shine so brightly. I never noticed that before, how easily things get broken." Takeaways for today. To be human is to be broken along the way. In the breaking of his body, Jesus breaks the curse of perfection. Place your brokenness under the light of God's blessing, and it will become a means to joy and peace.